Did you know there's a planet in Stargate with World War II era Germans on it? I couldn't really think of a clever way to start this video because, really, how does a statement like that not catch your attention? And to be clear, no, I don't mean the Urandans, whose ideology is similar to World War II era Germany. I mean World War II era Germans who have settled on a planet in Stargate. Where's this coming from, you might ask? Well, not one, not two, but three, count them three, of the old Stargate RPGs. Fantastic Frontiers, Friends and Foes, and First Steps. Now, I've had debates in the comment sections of my videos about the canonicity of the RPGs and other extended media for Stargate and how I use them in my videos, so I want to be clear here about this. I don't think this is canon. I don't know what to call this. But it's a story about the bad guys from World War II and Stargate and how they sailed a planet. How could I not talk about this? Two disclaimers before we begin. First, none of the old RPGs have original images for the stuff they created, so there's no visuals for anything I'm about to talk about. As such, I'm going to be using any World War II videos and photos I can find, and when I get to talking about the Colony, I'm mostly going to use the Heligas from the Killzone franchise because, well, I mean, how could I not? And this leads to disclaimer 2. You might have noticed I haven't said a specific word, and later I won't be using the name of a certain someone. YouTube is kind of inconsistent on this. Sometimes you can say their name and you'll be fine. Other times, immediate demonetization. I know that at some point about midway or near the end of the video, I can use those words, but until then, please bear with me. Also, bear with me as I am not German, and I'm probably going to mispronounce a lot of things. So where does this story start? Well, first let's look at Fantastic Frontiers. In 1928, Professor Paul Langford discovered the Stargate. I'll be honest, I don't know if the shows or movies ever went into detail about how the gate ended up in American hands. It just sort of did, and I'll get into a funny retcon later, but according to the RPG, the gate originally went to an Egyptian museum in Berlin. The Germans did do some tests on the gate, but remember, this was during the Weimar Republic, so Germany wasn't swimming in cash. I mean, they were, but not in a good way. Then, in 1933, a man with a funny mustache and failed to get into art school became Chancellor of Germany. Now, it's here I want to talk about a lore conflict between Fantastic Frontiers and Friends and Foes. In Friends and Foes, it doesn't really offer any info on the Colony, it just sort of restates info I'm going to cover from Fantastic Frontiers. But Friends and Foes does contradict the previous RPG in one way, saying the gate was confiscated and classified when it arrived in Berlin by a secret society, the Hermann Wirth Society, who believed it was connected to Atlanteans. Which, not wrong in this case. They believed the Atlanteans were a technologically and magically advanced people and wanted to learn their secrets. When the Mustache Man came to power, he had a new agency formed, a really long German word. For simplicity, let's call them the Anerbi, to study all this occult and Atlantis stuff, which effectively moved the Wirth from a secret society to part of the government as many members were recruited from it. And what's funny about all this is that it's mostly all true. I couldn't find anything about the Wirth Society, but Hermann Wirth was a real person who came up with a theory that Europeans were descendant of Atlanteans. I'm aware I might be saying Wirth wrong, but he was also part of the same party as the Mustache Man, so, you know.
Who gives a shit? They're Nazis!
And the Anerbi was a real group made by the Mustache Party to study these things. At one point, they were out in Finland looking for real wizards. Again, in real life, this was stuff they believed was real, and it's kind of funny given how the shows did end up connecting the Stargate to Atlantis. Though that does make me slightly concerned about how much of what they believed did end up in the show if you start thinking about it. Like how the Atlanteans returned to Earth and we know some of them mingled with the early tribes of man. That's a whole video topic I will cover one day in the future. Let's just stick to one rabbit hole for today. Anyway, getting back to Fantastic Frontiers, the Mustache Man was so interested in the gate, he greatly funded the research for it. Langford and his daughter had escaped to the US by this point, so it fell to the German military to study it. And later they managed to find the DHD near where the gate was found. Then in 1939, just at the start of the war, the Germans managed to piece together an address from stone fragments at the dig site. As such, they managed to dial another planet. So what's that? 3 times the gate has been opened before Daniel broke the code? Anyway, the Germans sent several explorers through, and only one came back. While he described a paradise on the other side, what he called heaven, he also said it was ruled over and overrun by near-human beings with horrendous powers of destruction. Apparently, the man who failed to get into art school took these depictions of heaven as literal and ordered thousands of troops and tons of equipment through the gate. The battle was long and hard, but after 1 year on the planet, it was in German control. While heaven was becoming a thriving German colony, filled with thousands of perfect Aryan men and women, there was an issue. Around this time, the German High Command were starting to get annoyed by the Mustache Man and his heavy-handedness and emotional instability. One of these men was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was a real person and despite serving in the German military, didn't like the Mustache Party or their leader all that much. Honestly, there's way too much to say about him for this video, so I highly recommend you to do some research on him after this video. Anyway, Rommel was terrified of the Stargate's possibilities. Specifically, he didn't want the resources from the colony to help the Mustache Band's plans for the future, or be an escape if they lost the war. When the colony became self-sufficient, he forged a set of requisitions to have the gate and other artifacts moved to the town of Rostock. Though the DHD would be kept separate just to make it impossible for someone to use the gate. But things didn't go quite as planned. When the war broke out, Professor Langford contacted the Roosevelt administration and told them about the gate. It became a top intelligence priority to find the gate, and thanks to Rommel's requisitions coming across the desk of an American mole, they knew where the gate was going to be. An elite commando unit got to the trucks before they could make it to Rostock. From there, the gate was moved across the Baltic Sea to Britain before it finally ended up in American hands, where President Roosevelt immediately ordered the gate to be studied as a possible weapon.
America.
Professor Langford led the project but disagreed in using it as a weapon. In 1945, as the war was winding down, the research team managed to dial an address, which was seen during the events of Torment of Tantalus. So I won't cover what happened in detail, but after the man they sent through didn't come back, all further attempts to use the Stargate were shut down, and with the war ending, there was no real need for the gate. So it was stored in a government warehouse for the next several decades. Meanwhile, the colony remained. Forgotten and left ignorant of Germany's defeat, their perverse ideology hasn't been allowed to flourish. Who knows what nightmare their idea of a master race has resulted from this, and what would happen if the SGC ever found out. So that was Fantastic Frontiers, but what does First Steps say? Well, for the most part, it restates most of the same info as the previous two, though we do get more history of the colony and what happened after it was cut off. The planet, which is now being called Himmel, which is German for heaven/sky, was under the control of Nirti, who used the planet to breed Jaffa, forcing the human tribes of the planet to fight each other, and once a year the strongest were taken and made into Jaffa. Funny enough, there's a part where it stated that the Mustache Party and the Goa'uld are similar, and could have made for a terrifying combination, but thankfully evil doesn't work well with evil, so they became immediate enemies. This RPG claims that the fight for the planet took many long battles, and the Germans had to pull from every resource they had to claim victory in the end. Well, kind of. See, it turns out, Nirti let them win. While the Germans were pulling from every resource they had to take the planet, she was debating whether or not to bomb the planet into oblivion. In the end, she decided that these new humans would make Great Jaffa one day. So she decided to leave the planet alone for 100 years and make use of whoever was left, which she'll never get a chance since SG-1 took care of her in 2003. Still, with their victory, the Germans took control of the planet's capital city, which they renamed Neo-Berlin. Originally, it was of Goa'uld design, but since then, its architecture now resembles that of the work of Albert Speer. They control a few outposts beyond the city, but the locals have proven to be resilient. The locals are called Himmelites by the Germans. As for their origin, they are descended from the peoples of Canaan from the Middle East. So you can imagine they don't get along well with the Mustache Party. Despite having the numbers and knowledge of the world, their tech level is just too far behind. Though, weirdly enough, the Mustache Party don't want to exterminate them, they want to subjugate them into a workforce, treating them like pack animals, keeping them healthy enough to work, but have no rights and are kept in labor camps. Okay, that's more in line with the bad guys we all love to hate from World War II. Though, joke's on them because the Himmelites have been letting some of their numbers be captured so they can try and learn their enemies' secrets. Now, you might think the Himmelites are the good guys, or at the very least, rebels fighting for their survival. But guess what? No. As the RPG describes them as resembling the Mustache Party, being, I quote, brutal, uncaring, and intelligent, with their end goal to find something that will let them wipe out every last colonist on the planet.
I'm not touching that one with a 20-foot pole.
I mean, I will, but near the end of the video. Since the conquest of the planet and getting cut off from Earth, the Germans have built themselves a somewhat stable empire, with occasional skirmishes with the Himmelites. The colonists are ruled by a governing council, made up of various branches of the party, armed forces, and specialty groups. Because of their slaves who do the hard labor, this freed up the lives of the colonists to pursue the military or other interests. For example, they have managed to find a way to merge Goa'uld tech with their original equipment, with it being on par or even better than what the SGC had at the time. By the way, in case you were wondering how or why these guys didn't conquer more planets after getting cut off from Earth, well, it turns out not only do they think the Stargate is a one-way portal, but it turns out they never thought the return address might be different. So after numerous attempts to dial Earth, after they got cut off, they just stopped. Though some do have a hope that one day Earth will redial them with news of their victory in the war.
I've got some bad news. Oh, and also some worse news.
Let's talk about NPCs, as the RPG does give us 3 people we can meet if one travels to this planet. First, Field Marshal Heinrich von Blocher, the oldest man on the governing council, who comes from a long line of military men, with his father being the original military commander of the colony. He's a well-respected man, but one with some dark secrets, as he's never really had a love for the ideology of the party and has some respect for the Himmelites. So much so that he had a child with one, though he is unaware of this fact. He secretly wishes to rid the colony of the council and hopes the Stargate will never reopen, as this means Mustache Man would have failed and would leave Himmel to a hopefully bright future. Next is Hans Skreek. He is this word, which means he's the governor of the colony. He's a fanatic believer in the party's ideals and the youngest person to be elected into office. He believes that this means he's meant to stand as the de facto Führer who will lead the colony to glory. That being said, his age is an issue, as only his fanatical belief has kept others from chafing his rule. Still, he's gaining more respect and could try to take absolute power one day. Finally, we have Zerubbabel, leader of the Himmelites, and Heinrich's son. His mother was killed when his father was ordered by the council to wipe out the village they were in. He's the only one on the planet who knows who his father is, though his looks have led to some to question his heritage, as his light hair and blue eyes are unknown to his people, with some saying he has German blood or sent by their goddess. While some might distrust him at first due to his looks, his hatred of the Germans is so great that no one questions him, having led several successful attacks against the invaders. The RPG book ends with some plot ideas for how First Contact would go, and how the players/DMs should handle it. But what's most interesting is how the conflict on Himmel could end. The story could end in one of 3 general ways. Options A and B involve forming some kind of alliance with either the Himmelites or the Germans, but the SGC will be hesitant to side with either group, as the Himmelites are just so brutal and are no better than the colonists, and the other group is, well,
Nazi!
That being said, both do offer some resources. The Himmelites have a vast population of warriors who could aid in the fight against the Goa'uld, but the Germans have had 50 years to integrate Goa'uld tech into human tech. To be clear, you could side with neither, but do enough damage that one side could overtake the other. Then there's option C, the one the RPG book says is the best, establishing peace between the two. A father and son lead both groups, and while there are those who could be a problem, many on both sides could be convinced to change their ways for the better, Knowledge that the Germans lost World War II and the death of Nirti would be a first step. All they need is a group of outsiders to show them the way.
Well, that was a load of shit.
So I'll be honest, I've had most of this script done since around the end of August. The thing I was stuck on was the ending. For a while, I just didn't know how to handle it. But taking some time to really think about it, here's what I've come up with. Starting off, I really don't mind this as a kind of origin story for how the gate ended up in America. Again, in SG-1 and the movie, as far as I can recall, they never went into detail about how the gate ended up in American hands. And it seemed like the writers of these RPGs did their research to make sure nothing they wrote contradicts the canon of the show too much, as well as the real historical groups and people involved. Although, remember that retcon I mentioned near the start of the video? Well, in Stargate Continuum, they retconned that in 1939, the gate was brought to America before the war broke out. Although retcon is a strong word since, again, I'm not sure any date or details were given before Continuum. But that's something you really can't put on the writers of the RPGs for not knowing, given these were written years before that movie came out. And it's kind of funny because Origins would later go on to touch on the idea of the Germans opening the gate first. And look, I know people don't like Origins. In fact, someone told me Brad Wright told them on Twitter that he hates it and doesn't consider it canon, though I haven't been able to confirm this. Origins has its problems, more than I care to go over at the moment. But I find it interesting the show would also take a shot at the idea of what the Germans during World War II might have used the gate for. Question I have for the comments, if you had to choose between these two backstories for the gate during World War II, which would you pick? Now, part of the reason I had such a hard time writing an end for this video was for a very specific part. The option they gave you to side with or make peace with the Nazis. And yes, I'm at the point in the video where I think, really, have to use that word because that is kind of the core of the issue here. Now, I don't think being given these options on their own is a bad thing. Remember, all this stuff is coming from the RPGs, role-playing games, where the whole point is to let people roleplay and do things they might not do. We've all done a Legion playthrough in New Vegas, made some dark side choice for the Sith Empire, or even chose to learn dark magic while being in Slytherin House. The only difference between these examples and the Nazis is, well, the Nazis are a real group. A faction like the Galactic Empire is fictional. When people say they would love to join it, they tend to do so while ignoring the horrors the Empire committed, which you can do because, again, it's not real. Both the Nazis, they were a real group whose ideology led to the deaths of millions of real people. Suddenly, that kind of affects your decision making, and the RPG does address this. In a way, I've gained a certain respect for these RPGs for giving you this option and addressing things you would consider. However, by that same token, we've reached the point I must disagree with the book, that being the peace option. Now look, peace is good. I like peace. However, the ending they talk about as the best option feels like it hand waves away a lot of the real-world problems that would arise from this. The book establishes that the Nazis treat the Himmelites like animals, and the Himmelites want to exterminate every colonist on the planet. And not just the men, but the women and the children. With mentalities like that, I don't believe many on both sides could be convinced to change their ways for the better. Look at the aftermath of the American Civil War and how freeing the slaves went. Yes, they were freed, but it took almost 100 years or so before equal rights were achieved in law. Realistically, this planet would be a constant drain on resources as the SGC would need to provide men to help keep peace between the two factions. With old party sympathizers who want to reestablish the old ways, or Himmelite extremists who want to commit terrorist acts. I get the impression they tried to write this planet like an episode of the week thing that we would see sometimes in Stargate, but realistically, the situation on the planet would be something talked about every other episode, and you can't just ignore. You know, I've been a proponent of the idea that lore elements from the books, games, RPGs, and comics should be brought into the proper Stargate canon. However, the reason this idea will never be brought into the canon is not because it contradicts Continuum or Origins, but because this idea is super complicated when you try and look at it from any angle. Again, part of the reason this was delayed was because it took me so long to write down my thoughts. and I'm really not 100% confident I've covered what I need to. I'm not even sure what to say about the Himmelites being described as just as brutal as the Nazis, because that's really a no-win scenario no matter what I say.
I'm not touching that with a 60-foot pole.
I do think this idea would be an interesting alternate universe idea, but besides that, I think this idea would be left to the history of old Stargate RPGs. But what do you think? Do you think there's a place for this idea in any future Stargate projects? And if you were on an SG team and traveled to Himmel, what would you do? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, leave a like and subscribe, follow me on my social medias, and remember,
Osiris.
Do it.